There's going to be another lecture followed by a practical, then a short lecture to end everything for the day. Followed by a photo shoot, which is my favorite part. Okay. Again, I'll be breaking out of the presentation to show a few things both online and a couple other applications. But the main subject of this workshop is functional connectivity, by and large. And to segue into that, we talked about a lot of pitfalls with task-based analysis that you saw. And a lot of those same considerations apply to resting state data as well, which is used primarily for functional connectivity. There are different types of functional connectivity, which I'll show you. But the most popular, widely used one is simply correlations between different voxels, correlating the time series. So I'll give you a brief background of functional connectivity. What is it? What's the history? How did we get to where we are today? So just some examples of different research and clinical applications you may come across, followed by a functional connectivity demo on my machine, and pitfalls of functional connectivity analysis. Again, there are a lot. We only covered a few of the big ones with, say, task-related data. And functional connectivity is no different. It has its own unique issues, primarily motion, which we'll be talking about for the majority of what the issues are and how to address them. But there are other ones as well. I always like to begin this with some history about how we got to where we are with functional connectivity. When neuroimaging was becoming much more popular in around, say, late 80s, early 90s, they had recently discovered how to make fMRI analysis much quicker and more efficient. Before then, you could only get a few slices, pretty coarse resolution, not a lot of signal. But as technological advances progressed, in around early 1990s, scanners were becoming more widespread. Universities, research centers, and they were a little bit cheaper too. They're still expensive, and not everybody can have one, but it was much more feasible to get one. And so in the early 1990s, a lot of what people were doing was simply, say, mapping out, primary sensory areas. People knew about things like the visual cortex, auditory cortex, for example, but it hadn't been done before with these non-invasive procedures, fMRI. They'd been doing PET imaging. It's more invasive. You have to inject a radioactive tracer inside the blood that binds to glucose and is then used by the brain, and it's very, very useful for making an inference about which neurons are actually using that tracer, but not everybody likes being injected, not everybody likes this radioactive tracer, and it has very coarse resolution. But, so they're mostly doing task analyses at this point, very, very basic ones. But in 1995, there was a graduate student named Bharat Biswal, who, as part of his studies, was trying to look at the noise component of fMRI data. So, there was a signal that you would get from, say, presenting somebody with a stimulus. But there's also, obviously, noise components as well. fMRI data is notoriously noisy. The signal you get is not that strong, which is why you need a lot of trials to average over. And his idea was, well, when people are just at rest, there's no real signal going on there. Is there really going to be any kind of structured signal that I can detect? And what he found was actually there is, surprisingly enough. And what he did was, say, on this side over here, we have somebody doing that motor pressing task. Right? If you remember that image I showed you, we have left motor cortex and right motor cortex. Pretty simple. I can have you press left buttons, right buttons, take the contrast, and get a pretty clean map. But what he found is if you just looked within this mask, this subset of voxels, say, let's say he had an atlas and he defined a mask based on these left motor cortex voxels. And he averaged the time series across all of these, and he found that it's not just totally random, it actually correlates quite well with its homologue on the right hemisphere. Which makes sense if somebody is a healthy, neurologically intact subject, these two motor cortices are probably communicating with each other in some way. It's a very vague term. I don't like throwing it around, but they would think that this is a way that you could indicate that. And you'll also notice it's not just within its opposite homologue, but also in some other voxels as well, such as the midline region. Let's say this is, I don't know, frontal eye fields or something. So what's exactly going on there? Because this isn't totally random. You find it's a pretty robust so-called network or constellation of correlated masks throughout the brain. So if I go back here, what I have highlighted in red, we call that a seed region. Okay, I'm using some of these terms interchangeably. I'll use seed region, ROI, mask. Kahn calls them sources. Okay, these are all the same name for basically the same thing. But seed region is what Bharat Biswal called it. So here's how it's done. If I have a seed region, let's say at the center of my crosshairs right here, right? And that time course is highlighted in blue, right? I can correlate that with all the other voxel time courses in the brain. So let's say I have one over here. This is a pretty common constellation or network you would see. That would have a pretty high similarity with their time course. Let me show you briefly how that will work. Again, you don't have to do this. I'm using a different software package, but I think it's a pretty effective demonstration to show what I'm talking about. This is, let's see here. Also from workshops. So this is a sample functional connectivity image, very small. Not a whole lot going on here. This is something I like about Fossilize. I tend to use different components from different software packages, and FSL's viewer is very, very good. So here's a typical fMRI data set, and I can also view its time series as well. So what you'll notice down here, so where I have my crosshairs highlighted, this is the time series. Okay. Again, just going back to basics, when we acquire a functional image, we acquire it over time. And its temporal resolution, also known as the TR, is how many seconds does it take to acquire a full image? To acquire one of these three-dimensional images composed of all these little voxels. TRs of 1 to 3 seconds are pretty common every time you take a snapshot of the brain. All right, so I can use, this is all in Fossilize. If you click on Tools, Seed Correlation, this will generate, this is working better before. Find a better seed. I guess we could use that one. Still not happy with it. Sorry, let me find a good one. This isn't really working how I had it last night. I'm not going to worry too much about this, honestly. Load something else. Just bear with me 1 second. Not cooperating, but that's all right. I was hoping to show is I could look at some different networks and you'd kind of see how these different networks would show up depending what seed I used. It's crazy because I generated it from that same data set, so it's very curious. In any case, all we're looking for in a functional connectivity analysis is a high correlation between different voxels, depending on the seed region. Now, the seed region could be a single voxel, could be an entire ROI, could be an entire network. It really depends on the scale that you're looking at. Could be any of those. So not only do we seem to have this structured signal in this resting state time series between different parts of the brain, but there's also an interesting dynamic that happens between these different networks that were identified after a while. So this is Gordon Shulman back in 1997, and I think this was a PET analysis, I believe. Yeah. But what he found, this is a slightly different image than what we're used to looking at, but he found that metabolic increases in certain areas, like the anterior cingulate, for example, were accompanied by decreases in other regions. So specifically, he would find that in these more frontal areas, say in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, you would find an anti-correlation with other regions of the brain in healthy non-patient populations, suggesting that there needs to be some kind of dynamic between, at rest, there should be a certain correlation between certain networks and also an anti-correlation with other networks in order for normal cognitive functioning. So for example, dorsal ACC, interparietal sulcus, when he had them doing a task, for example, there was highly correlated activity between those. Well, things like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, which I'll show you more in a second, showed consistently lower levels of activity and blood flow during those same tasks. So, applied to an fMRI context, this was a paper back in 2005 by Michael Fox and colleagues. He found if he planted, say, a seed region in this posterior cingulate cortex right here, this is an inflated brain. It's a different way to view the same data. You would show a lot of correlation between that and the frontal pole right here at rest, and anti-correlation with these so-called task, positive networks, which consisted of IPS, frontal eye fields, and some of the motor cortices. So over here, what you can see is if we extract from that seed, we have an orange. I think that was their reference. And then they correlate that with something like the MPFC in yellow, and that's anti-correlated with everything in blue, cyan right here. So I can see, obviously, just anti-correlation means as one goes up, one goes down, and vice versa. When I'm talking about functional connectivity, that's the dominant method that I'm referring to, simply taking these correlations. And some people have a problem with it. Some people say, well, it's not really connected necessarily. I'm talking about connecting two cables. It's not the same idea. That comes in with something called structural connectivity, to make the terms a little bit more clear. Anybody done any diffusion analysis, DTI, things like that? Yeah. So that's a way to try to reconstruct fiber pathways that connect, like a literal structural sense, different parts of the brain. And so somebody asked me actually, well, how can you match these two things up if I have, say, two regions of the brain in my functional data, the resting state, that are correlated? How do those map on with these structural connections? It's a good question. We don't have the time to go into diffusion analysis in this particular workshop. Maybe when I come back, who knows? But I am working on a tutorial with MRTrix, if anybody's heard of that. It's a diffusion analysis software package. But at the end of this workshop, we will be creating these things called connectomes, which are these correlation matrices for all these different regions of the brain, how they are correlated with each other. You can also do that for diffusion analysis as well, to see how many of these streamlines connect different parcellations, and then you can use them to see if there are certain matches between the two or if they differ between groups. So a little teaser, but that's to be continued, and also to make the distinction between those two things pretty clear. You also may encounter something called effective connectivity. I tried this once and I couldn't figure it out, so I'm not going to pretend I really know that much about it. But the basic idea is you're still working with these functional correlations, but you're making an inference about what activity is driving activity in another region. So it's causal. You're saying, I forget what these refer to, is region LG directly causing or modulating the activity in FG? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yes. This is what they're referring to when they talk about DCM, dynamic causal modeling. This is a technique that was developed by Carl Friston, the developer of SPM, and there is a DCM button in the interface. I tried it once. I failed, so I don't know. I haven't. Is that true? I don't think I've met anybody who has done it. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but it seems to be very difficult to do. And some people, I should actually provide a reference, but yeah, there's some question about the validity of making these causal inferences. I wish I could remember the paper I read, but it is out there. Trust me. Okay, so I just want to still be clear about all these different types of connectivity. For the rest of this course, when I talk about connectivity, it's going to be in the sense of functional connectivity. And we have some variations on that. There are things like psychophysiological interactions, which we will do. There's beta series analysis, which we won't do today, but it's another type of functional connectivity. So you may ask, well, what is this actually used for? Well, how can I use it with my own data set? There are some research and also clinical applications. The most common one that I've come across is, if you just want to compare different groups, right? There's a pretty simple, straightforward thing to do, comparing these different networks. So if you have people diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and you compare, say, their default mode network, that's a key term, I'll get to that in a second, between the three groups, you can actually see differences between them. I'm not showing the contrasts in this one, but you can see in the frontal areas, there seems to be slightly more activity in healthy controls as compared to the other ones. And this is used pretty widely. Again, it's not in itself a terribly complicated analysis to do, but it is available for you to do as part of the Con toolbox, and it's pretty simple. What I would say is some of the networks that are most commonly analyzed to compare groups, things like the default mode network. I was hoping to show that in my little demo. But this is a very common resting state network to find when people are just doing nothing. Right? So if I set a seed in, say, the posterior cingulate cortex over here, you would find a high degree of correlation with the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, more anterior and a little bit inferior. Other networks as well, which we will take a look at. Now, the Con toolbox comes with a bunch of different networks that you can look at as part of your analysis. And as I mentioned, as part of trying to link up, say, functional and structural connectivity, another application is something called the connectome. It's a bit of a buzzword, but it does have a technical definition. If I take the brain, you may recall these atlases I was referring to for parcellating the brain, right? So we can parcellate it according to structural features, right? If something is, say, behind the anterior commissure and it's, at these certain coordinates and has these boundaries and it's bounded by this particular structure, I can call that, anterior cingulate sulcus, the mid-body, or the frontal pole, or something like, I forget if that's motor cortex, something like that, right? You can make all these parcellations. And once you have those, instead of correlating individual voxels with each other, you can simply correlate these different regions with each other. And if I then construct a matrix, which is the number of ROIs by the number of ROIs, you'll see these graphs that can reveal certain structure to these functional connections. I can't really zoom in on this, but what you would see is things like pretty clear differentiations between the hemispheres, for example. you would find if I had different resolution, you could cluster different parts of the brain together, like the motor cortices, visual cortices, different parts of the brain like that. So brighter colors indicate stronger connections between these different ROIs. There's one more application you might see. This was by Emily Finn and colleagues. I believe she's at Dartmouth, I think. But this was back when she was at Yale and Todd Constable's group. So she took these connectomes that I was just talking about, and the same way that we all have a unique identifying fingerprint, right? You can do the same thing for these resting state networks as well, for these connectomes. So everybody seems to have a different pattern of connectivity between the different regions in their brain, which is pretty interesting because they, ran a classifier on this, and it was very, very accurate. Some, I think, I don't want to throw a false number around. It was very high, like very high above chance that you could identify somebody just given their connectome. Like if I analyzed Michelle's connect. I'm just trying to get names. And out of everybody's connectome in this entire group, I could reliably, if I kind of shuffle that up and train a classifier on that, it could still identify her if she was scanned at another time period. So they're both stable and they seem to have identifying characteristics. Okay. A few words just about other connectivity type analyses. PPI is a big one, but beta series, I haven't seen this done too often these days. It was pretty big back in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And you can do this as part of what's called a task-based functional connectivity analysis, right? Everything I've talked about so far is mainly resting state. So the person's doing nothing. They're simply laying down in the scanner. And it's a great task because it's really hard to screw it up, right? You can't have like a timing issue. That's not a problem in resting state. The only problem is you don't want the person to fall asleep and you don't want them to move too much. Aside from that, I mean, that's all there is to it. You just press go. If, however, you're still interested in functional connectivity, but the person is doing a task, one way to do it is to do beta series. So what that means is if I have, say, 3 occurrences of a single condition, let's say Q1, Q2, Q3, right? I can generate a beta estimate for each of those. So beta estimate for 1, 2, 3. I can do that for an individual voxel. And then I'm basically daisy chaining all of those beta estimates together, beta series. So then I do that for one voxel, then I can look at another voxel and say, do I get that same pattern of rises and falls? So it's related to, you may think that this seems a little bit similar to just, say like a task-based kind of beta estimate interaction, but in this case, we're not necessarily testing for the significance of the beta weight, right? So these things can vary up and down. They could average out to be somewhat negative or just not different from 0, but we're looking at whether the fluctuations between different voxels are similar. And if they are, that would seem to give some indication that there is, again, communication between these different areas. And it does seem to work. I mean, if you do this with, say, a motor task, it does seem to reliably recapture this motor network, and you can use it in other regions as well. So again, it's an option for task-related connectivity, but again, I don't want to say too much about it if it's fallen out of favor, but I just haven't seen it done that much, that often these days. Another more popular type of task-based connectivity, which is still going pretty strong, is something called psychophysiological interactions, or PPIs. There's some controversy about what to call this thing. The AFNI group, for example, they call it context-dependent correlations. PPI is what the SPM developers called it way back in the day, in the 90s, when they developed this method. I'm just going to call them PPIs. The idea, so why they call it PPI, a psychophysiological interaction. There are 3 regressors that go into a PPI analysis. The first one is a psychological variable. That's the psycho part of psychophysiological interaction. If somebody is exposed to 2 tasks, for example, task A, task B, it could be, can I think of a new example? No, I can't. Incongruent, congruent. Really simple flanker task, let's say. Does the connectivity between different brain regions change as a result of which psychological condition they're in? Well, to answer that, we also need a physiological regressor, which is the time series extracted from a seed region. So beforehand, you've got to identify exactly which seed region you're interested in. It could be something like, let's say it's a gambles task. There's the gambling task and the control task or something like that. And I want to see how the connectivity between their, the so-called, cognitive control regions like the DACC and the nucleus accumbens, the so-called reward regions, how that connectivity changes based on whether they're in the gambling condition or something else that doesn't involve gambling. I like that example better. I just came up with it. It's not bad. Good study. So what I have to do is, first of all, create, say, a seed region in either the nucleus accumbens or DACC, what have you. And then I would multiply these 2 regressors together to get my interaction term. Okay? So what this means, I'm not just looking for 2 regions that are connected, functionally connected, correlated. Actually, if I was just looking at, if I did a PPI analysis, the interaction term would not load onto any voxels which simply have a one-to-one correlation with each other, because we're looking at only those voxels that change their correlation as a result of what task they're in. So think of task A as being weighted with a +1 and task B with a -1. So it's a little hard to see here, I apologize, but you can see here, so when we're in task B, it's flipping the sign of this physiological regressor. So it's a negative deflection here, but the interaction term, it's a positive deflection, and vice versa. When we're task B, it's going up, it's going to be going negative in the interaction term. Make sense? Okay. Any questions about that? We'll be coming back to it in the con toolbox when we actually run a GPPI analysis. Okay. Yeah. I'd say that's the biggest hurdle. It's like, well, it's not just looking at connectivity, it's that multiplied by something else. And so the major problem with PPIs, we'll be doing one for a single subject. It's in this data set, it's not really going to yield anything meaningful because it's a single subject. But even if you have a full data set, and I cannot emphasize this enough, with PPIs, you need a massive amount of power to detect any effect. Why is that? If you're only looking at the interaction term, if these 3 things go into your model, and they will, you have to model all 3, because we want to make sure that our interaction term isn't affected by, that we're detecting something above and beyond both the task effect and this connectivity effect. So anything that remains after you've regressed out that stuff is your interaction term, which is not a whole lot when you remove this other source of variance. So it's going to be very, very difficult to find something unless you have a very clear change in connectivity as a result of change in condition. Very difficult to see. I've run this kind of analysis a couple times just kind of for kicks because we had nothing to lose really, but I've never gotten something out of it, even with 40 odd subjects. So you need to have a really strong hypothesis, and the data needs to be adequately powered to find this. When you do find it, though, it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Do you know if this has been done with any of the larger, like collaborative
No, I don't actually. So the question was, do I know of examples of PPI with these larger repositories? I don't recall any examples, actually. Yeah. Doesn't mean they don't exist, but that would be a fruitful avenue to investigate. Strongly.
You call it interaction with regressor. How is this different if we regress out both task A and task B
Separately?
from the data set?
Sorry, regress out task A and task B.
We can, for example, we can use the HRF
Mhm.
prediction for both task A and task B and create a design matrix for both of them
Mhm.
and regress out those effects from each box of the three.
I believe this will do the same thing, though. What we'll see, there's a variation on this generalized PPI, which the Khan toolbox uses by default, which is also, it'll create an interaction term for every combination of tasks in your data set. I'm not sure if this is getting at your question, but the point is, I mean, these tasks are accounted for. They are regressed out of the data, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to clarify, for GPPI, basically your task A could be any condition in your task versus task B is kind of your baseline. So GPPI would be able to tell you what areas of the brain move with others during the task. Is that like the implication?
No, it's simply an extension of this basic framework. So as in, like, if I had 3 tasks, 3 conditions, it would adequately account for all of them. The problem with this one is it's restricted to 2. And you may be able to do it even if you have multiple conditions, like 3 or 4, but it's not really going to be statistically appropriate because there are these other sources of, these other interaction terms you're not modeling. Yeah. It's simply capturing the entire experimental space. That's the only variation on it. But what's the name? Donald McLaren and his group, they show that it gives you superior results compared to standard PPI analysis. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else here? Yeah. That was it. Now, functional connectivity preprocessing. What we have just done, the reason that I wanted everybody to download and run that sample SPM script, one is to test whether your SPM works, because the Khan toolbox will use SPM commands for everything. But it also did a bunch of pre-processing steps, which we're going to revisit in a little bit. How should I put this? Everybody has taken a picture with the camera, with their phone, right? Okay. So everybody, familiar experience for everybody. And you take a picture of it. Let's say, a friend takes a picture of you, and you don't like it. You're like, lighting wasn't good. There's some red eye. I need some concealer. Things like that. What you can do in Photoshop afterwards is make yourself look really good, right? You can remove a lot of things. You can airbrush it. You can look, really, really great. The same idea happens with pre-processing. So instead of these 2-dimensional images that we take with, say, a phone, for example, we have these 3-dimensional images that are being reconstructed from this MRI machine. But we have the same problem. If I were to be moving while somebody took a picture of me, it would look blurry, right? And it's the same thing if somebody moves a lot when they're in the scanner. The picture looks blurry. It needs to be relatively stable for it to be a crisp, clear image. So, and we do a few other things. We do normalization. I'll be going over those in a little bit. But with task-based analyses, motion is a problem, right? Insofar as we don't want it to be confounded with our actual task. It makes the data look a little bit worse too. That's not good as well. But the major problem is we want to regress it out to make sure that any effect that we do see is a result of the task and not of motion. It's a problem if, say, you're shocking somebody or showing them a really disturbing picture or something, and they might move as they're doing those things. With functional connectivity, motion is very, very, very bad. I'll show you just how bad in a second. As a result, when you're doing preprocessing, in any toolbox you use, I mean, whether you use the Con toolbox, whether you use some of the scripts that come with AFNI that they put on their website or FSL, SPM, their motion cutoffs are going to be much more severe and much more stringent than you would find with task-related connectivity. So how to deal with this? I mean, traditionally, if you've done task-related analyses before, you get a certain file that indicates how much they've moved in each direction and how much they've rotated. In addition, if somebody has moved a little bit too much in a certain during a certain snapshot, you have options to account for it. One is to pretend like it never existed. You snip it out, remove it, set it aside. You splice the rest of the time series together and interpolate it as though it just never existed. It's one option. Another one is called motion. So let me back up. Motion scrubbing can refer to that. I've heard a couple different ways. One is to delete volumes, just the way I told you. The other one is to insert those volumes as individual regressors in your design matrix. That seems to be preferred, using them as regressors, because it doesn't seem to disrupt the original time series as much that you used. So as we go on, I'm going to use motion scrubbing in the sense of using it as a regressor. Some people call it motion censoring. Same thing. Now, as we're doing this motion correction, in addition to these so-called translation, rotation parameters that we use for motion correction, there are also things called frame-wise displacement. Instead of 6 individual motion parameters, you get a single number that's almost like a composite of all of those different motion parameters. It's not strictly the same thing as an average, but it's pretty close. It's technically something called the root mean square of all that. And another similar idea, something called dvars, which is the root mean square change in bold signal between volumes. The Con toolbox uses frame-wise displacement. To be specific, it uses this additional toolbox called the ART toolbox, Artifact Removal Toolbox. If you've come across that, it's an add-on for SPM, and it works pretty well. If you want to use that for your task data, you can also use it for that. For the Con toolbox, it's a really good way to generate these frame-wise displacement metrics and use them to flag certain volumes for insertion into the design matrix. Common cutoffs are about 0.2 of a millimeter, frame to frame. Some people think even that is too generous, and they prefer to tighten it up even further. Special populations. People work with them. Kids. Anybody work with kids? Couple people? Okay. Whenever. So, a big part of my job is consulting, and when people come to me with questions about analyzing kids, my heart sinks, because I'm like, the unvarnished truth is, in certain cases, there's not a whole lot you can do about motion. We have all these fancy tools these days to try to correct for it after the fact. And it's great. We have very sophisticated means for doing that, scrubbing, deleting, a bunch of other things. But really nothing can account for the fact or can compare with having a subject who's compliant and just being still. It just makes, there's no way to mimic that. There's no way to substitute for that. So, it's a common problem with very young people, very old people, any of these patient populations. It's a big problem. I'm no expert with patient populations, so I can't give you a bunch of recommendations aside from, it does kind of depend from case to case. because you throw away too many volumes, you have nothing left to do any kind of analysis. If you leave in volumes that are bad, you get spurious results. I mean, there's really no way to get around that. I will say, let me throw in a plug for this. What was her name? I forget the name. So, I need to remind myself to send out this reference, but this came out a few years ago. Something called Inscapes. Inscapes. People have heard of it? Yeah. Yeah. They're just so you can show this to children, older people, whatever, and they're like these kind of like psychedelic, kind of like blending weird things that kind of come in and out. But they keep people's attention pretty focused, and even they're not technically doing anything aside from just looking at this thing, this blob kind of changing shape. And even when people do that, you can recover the resting state networks. It's virtually identical. So it's a great way to keep people to stay awake and keep still. Inscapes. Yeah. All right. Other issues, other pitfalls with functional connectivity. So motion is bad. Just don't have your people move, and you'll be fine, maybe. Another question that's come up over the years is something called global signal regression. Should we include it or not? This is another big, I'd say controversy. Tasks, data had their voodoo correlations moment, their cluster failure moment. Functional connectivity had their global signal regression moment. What is global signal? It's simply taking the average signal across the entire brain for the entire scan. The rationale is this global signal includes a lot of noise. It includes a lot of components that are due to heart rate, due to respiration, due to thermal noise, scanner noise, everything. And especially in data sets where noise is predominant, this is a good way to account for that. And then anything left over, you can kind of tease apart with your functional connectivity analysis. The thing is, though, obviously the global signal can also contain signal as well. It just seems to be better capturing the sources of noise, which is why some people like to keep it in there. Understandable, right? But mathematically, and I'm not going to go through the derivation, partly because I can't do it, but it forces the distribution of correlations to center around 0. Why is this a problem? This is so the original GSR, I showed that image from Fox et al., that anti-correlation study. That used GSR to find these anti-correlations. One goes up, one goes down. Kevin Murphy and colleagues, they said, well, okay, GSR, we understand why you'd want to use it, but if it's going to center all the distributions around 0, what happens exactly? I wish I could blow this up a little bit, but what you'll see, well, just kind of compare in gross terms what's happening on the left versus on the right. So on the left is without global signal regression, right? And in general, they tend a little bit in the positive direction. After global signal regression, they're centered around 0, virtually centered around 0. So why is that a problem? It forces that shift to happen. Any guesses? Yeah.
Is that going to increase your power artificially?
Increase power artificially. I don't think it would necessarily do that, but it will have a systematic effect on the correlate. Think more about the correlations that you're observing. Yeah.
The guess is that they're less likely to be above a certain threshold for what we consider to be a high enough correlation to matter?
It's in the right direction. Yeah, I haven't thought about that, but yeah, it might kind of push down the positive correlations. Yeah, I think that's kind of getting to what you're. Yeah, I kind of see what you're saying more. Yeah, it does do both of that, but the main issue was it can introduce spurious negative correlations, because just by mathematical necessity, you have to have a certain proportion of negative correlations now, even ones that may not have existed before. It doesn't mean they're all spurious, but if you run simulations, you find a lot of negative correlations where they weren't there before.
So is it forcing it to have like half of your correlations as positive and half as negative?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So what they found is that it does seem to it actually does seem to clean up the positive correlations. Like it's making them more similar to what they actually should be, right? Okay. In general, and you'll see this in the contour box. I'll show you before and after it does this denoising step. Due to noise, the noise components we find in resting state data, as physiological, scanner, everything like that, they do seem to shift the correlations positive, and we do want to bring them back a little bit. I mean, that seems to be the correct area that they just naturally should be in. But GSR seems to overcorrect for that and push too many of them into the negative category. Okay. So, yes, this removes certain artifacts. It can account for certain sources of noise, but it also can introduce false negative correlations. So like I said, if you have a lot of noise in your study, GSR might not be such a bad idea. Murphy and Fox, they went back and forth in this, a few papers. Then a few years ago, they sat down together. It was a very kumbaya moment, and they wrote a paper. This is like their consensus paper on what to do. And I don't want to mind read too much, and it's hard to know who wrote what. But I still feel like Murphy still was like, no, just don't do it. The argument was certain situations you can do it. Maybe check it both with and without. Okay, fine. But what I will point out is that with something like the contour box, their approach is to denoise through something called principal components analysis. So what is this? What they will do is they'll segment the brain into the gray matter, the white matter, and the CSF. White matter and CSF in general, we're not interested in those. Those tend to be thought of as noise. There are some detractors saying actually there is signal in white matter, don't just throw it out. For now, I'm going to assume that you're not interested in it. So in CSF and white matter, if you can extract certain components that best represent what the time course looks in those areas, and then regress that out of the gray matter signal, that's a way to try to account for these fluctuations which may be more noise-like. Yeah? Why multiple components per tissue type? Well, so another approach was to simply take the average of all the signal and say the white matter and the CSF and regress those out. That's one approach and understandable, but it might be slightly different in one part of, say, the white matter as opposed to another part of the white matter. So extract multiple components and filter all of those out of the gray matter, you get a more refined signal out of that. That's called ANAT CompCore, which stands for anatomical component something. Name escapes me now, but that's the basic idea. And it also regresses out motion covariates. It does scrubbing and all that. That's a little dark. Let me, at the risk of putting people to sleep. No, okay. Hope you can see that a little bit better. This is an output you'll see in the contour box when we start working with it. What you see in this blue distribution, this darker distribution, that's before all the denoising and a net CompCore is applied. In yellow is after the denoising is applied. So the contour box by default does not do global signal regression. You have the option to do so if you want to. And I can show you how to do that. But for this, you can see that, for a typical subject, it's not perfectly centered at 0, but it's pretty close, even after doing Kahn's denoising pipeline. So you see, well, yeah, okay, the GSR folks have a pretty good point in that, before you do denoising, a lot of the correlations are skewed towards positive. Contour box, you get similar results, but without imposing this mathematical necessity that the correlations have to be negative. It just tends to work out that way after you clean up the data. Okay, so a few more caveats here. Yeah, we're making good time. Okay, it's another view on these so-called noise regressors. So I haven't been here since they've constructed the new scanner here. It's in the building, right? Back in my day, we had to take a shuttle over to Martha Morehouse. Is that what it's called? Morehouse building? Yeah. It was rough. It's rough. Day like today. But now you don't even leave the building. You just go downstairs, right? You're getting soft. But do they have physiological? They do. Oh, like a respiration belt and cardiac thing on the finger, oximeter. Wow. Okay, great. If you have those, excellent. Definitely include those because they're very good at capturing these physiological sources of noise. And what you might notice if you look at specifically where those noise regressors load, there are, say, cardiac regressors, respiratory regressors, and you can also take the interaction between them if you want to. What do you notice about the cardiac regressors? Where are they most highly loading? Do you know your neuroanatomy? Yeah,
Looks like
Matthew.
it's surrounding the blood vessels.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. These carotid arteries, they start to enter the brain. Yeah, I mean those are going to pick up on these pulsation artifacts. Any kind of systematic correlation between these cardiac regressors you have and signal will be captured by those. And for respiration, what do you notice about that? Where's it loading, and why would you think that? Does this make sense? These are like some sanity checks to do when you look at your own physiological regressors. Everybody take a deep breath. I love that sound. Yeah, what do you notice? Huh? Well, yeah, around the edge of the brain. Yeah, because your head's moving, right? You take a deep breath in. Not only do you feel more relaxed and focused, but your head moves. That's not good as far as resting state is concerned. So yeah, when you look at them, you should see basic patterns like this. Some people like to take the interaction. It's up to you. I'm kind of indifferent about it, but either way. Okay. So we're still on the topic of pitfalls and what to do. I'm going to end by talking about some caveats just to scare you a little bit, and then we'll come back to the con toolbox and how it should fix everything. A thing I get asked a lot is, well, not a lot, but sometimes, is how long of a scan do you need for resting state? What are some numbers that people use? How many minutes? 5 minutes, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. More than 10? Who does it? Okay. 10 is pretty good. Not gonna lie. But I will say this, I know everybody's dirty little secret because I've helped write a few grants in my day. I've been around, seen some stuff. And what I notice is that when people will write their budgets, what happens is they say, okay, I have this much scan time for doing my, whatever task, my gambling task. Okay, I have this much for an anatomical scan. How much time do we have left? Paul, you're helping me write this grant. How much time do we have left? Just give me a number. 30 minutes? Say like 8 minutes. What? 8 minutes. Oh, let's just put a resting state scan on the end of it, because why not, right? That's what happens. People will just kind of cram that into the very end of it. They won't really think about what they'll do with it. But because of that, a lot of these scans, it's hard to replicate them very well because you don't have, say, a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Say, reliability. Let's say, if I scan the same person a couple times in a row, if it's only 5 minutes, it's going to be pretty variable. If I scan for 30 minutes, that's a lot better. Stephanie Noble has been writing about this, and I don't know why she hasn't talked more about it because this totally blew my mind when I saw it. And when I was helping write a grant, I brought this up, and I was laughed at because there's it can't possibly be that long for you to get a reliable measure because we're trying to do something where it was kind of before and after, and we want to make sure that we get a reliable measure. anything that we see isn't because of variation, but actually is because of some intervention. And we can see on this y-axis is within session data, you collect, 12 minutes for one session. Your reliability is pretty bad. You collect multiple sessions, it gets better and better, but you're looking at, her conclusion was you need a lot to have this kind of within subject reliability. You're doing between groups is a slightly different story because you're taking more of the average across them. You may not be as subject to this, but for other people, you really need to be aware of this. And Stephanie Noble's the one who, as far as I know, has done the most work on it. Again, sobering, but when you think about it, would you ever collect just 10 minutes of task, and that's it? No, right, 30, 40 minutes, right? That seems to be pretty common. And for some reason, resting state is different. No, I don't think so. Okay, yeah.
Can you just talk briefly, I'm not familiar with this paper, but like what this means exactly? Like what does this
Yeah. They had criteria for reliability measures. Again, kind of arbitrary, but not unreasonable, right? So good was, I forget the exact number, but it wasn't anything like crazy. Yeah. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but it seemed like pretty reasonable. Yeah.
Is there any issue with throwing a resting state scan on at the end of like a bunch of tasks if you're eliciting like emotion?
People have asked about that. Yeah, good question. So when should you collect the resting state scan? Ideally, it should be one of the first, like before you do the task, I would say. That's my preference. Again, I'm blanking on names, but I could swear that I read a paper where somebody looked at that, where they had the resting state after like really fatiguing or really emotionally exhausting tasks. And it is different, which kind of makes sense, you'd think. Which also means maybe we should screen people for if they like had a fight that morning or something, because it might change it, So that's my recommendation. Again, but it's kind of a balancing act because you also need to consider the subject's endurance just to do the whole thing. And resting state at the very end is so easy because it's like a treat, right? They just get to go in the magic fingers, shaking bed and just zone out for a while. Magic fingers refers to these really dilapidated hotels where you insert quarters and you get a massage on your bed, but they're parodied in movies and cartoons, in case you're wondering. So you have learned something. Does anybody I've never seen one of those, but they exist. Okay, it's not the hotels I go to apparently. Okay. But the when you're doing the scans, DTI scans, they shake, and some people find them relaxing. I can't stand it, but there you go. All right, a few more slides here. Kind of spoke to this again. So how many scans can you remove? This is really kind of study sensitive. Depends how many. It's a balancing act between power and spurious results, right? So with this reproducibility problem, a lot of people are pointing the finger at, especially if you're looking at, say, patient populations, because we make so many accommodations to retain as much data as possible, we may be retaining a lot of scans that are not of high data quality. It's a problem. Again, I don't have any hard and fast answers here. When people are scanning, say, older subjects, younger subjects, I do recommend maybe loosen up the FD threshold a little bit. It's hard to say. I try to not make it totally subject dependent. Now, recently there has been it's called FIRM, F-I-R-M-M, Damien Fair, his lab, and some other people. And this is a way to collect resting state data as the subject is being scanned. Has anybody used it here? It's called FIRM. Yeah, you've used it, yeah. How does it, I'm curious, does it seem to work pretty well?
We are just starting this a month ago, but no one actually used it up
Okay.
for a scan time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's their major, I think that's major point.
Yeah.
So you set up a longer time and
Right.
you stop if you have enough
Exactly. So you may have a criteria like I want 100 good scans of resting state data. And firm will track in real time as they're being scanned whether this is a good volume or bad volume. Bad volume, it tosses it out, and you need to collect another one to fill in that gap until you reach the threshold. So if they're a good, well-behaving subject, they get out earlier. If they're a bad subject, they're in there forever. And you're in purgatory. So firm, F-I-R-M-M, I forget what it stands for, but Damien Fair is, I believe, the developer or the lead author on it. Okay. Let's see. Really, just a couple more slides to drive home this point about motion. So, let me see here. Let me skip to this slide because this kind of makes the point more salient. This is Van Dyke et al., 2011. They grouped, I think they had 100 subjects or so. They had a lot of subjects, and they grouped them according to how much they moved. So group 1 moved the least, if I recall correctly. Group 10 moved the most, something like that. I forget how they were ranked exactly. But you can see that, okay, if I have group 1 versus group 10, not surprisingly, I take the contrast between their correlation maps, there's going to be a difference due to motion. Okay, they're matched on everything else. This is probably due to motion. But even look at, say, group 5, group 6, which are right next to each other. And in this case, I think was like a few hundredths of a millimeter difference categorizing these groups. That was the only difference between them, their overall motion across the scan. And there's still a significant difference in some areas between the two groups. Right? So it makes one a little wary about making inferences about group differences. Now, again, I mean, there are things you can do. You can, you can match them on their motion thresholds and just be censoring or scrubbing all the volumes that are beyond that. Try to get them as close as possible, but just be aware that this still is a very, very sensitive, insidious problem for a lot of these studies. And it's hard to tell exactly how much your individual study is affected by it. All I'm trying to say is you need to just make sure that your subjects are as still as possible. That's really the only thing I can recommend. Let's see here. Oh yeah, this one. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about this during the contour box. This is also coming up in task data as well. This is a question about bandpass filtering. When should you do it? And so some people bandpass filter, then they run all the rest of their pre-processing steps. And the problem with this, which was shown by Hallquist a few years ago, is if you then do, let's say you bandpass filter, say the motion regressors, the data, then you do motion correction, then you introduce those motion correction regressors back in. Those motion regressors can still contain some of that data that you filtered out. Okay, so what they're recommending these days, and especially in the contour box, is to do regression and then the bandpass filtering on the data afterwards before you, regress out all the confound artifacts and then do the bandpass filtering before you do your connectivity analysis. The idea being you don't want to reintroduce some of these frequency fluctuations that you already regressed, that you had bandpass filtered out. Let me put that another way. Let's see here. So I bandpass filter the data, and then I try to regress out my motion regressors. Those motion regressors can still contain information about these frequency bands. Does that make sense? Because they haven't, though the confound regressors haven't been bandpass filtered, just the raw data has. If that makes sense. It doesn't totally gel, don't worry, because it is done as a default for you in the contour box. They do regression and then bandpass filtering. Okay, so we're almost at break time. We're going to, when we come back, we'll be talking about how the contour box does all this. We'll be seeing how they account for all these pitfalls in real time. And here are the steps we're going to be following for the rest of the day. We're going to pre-process the data. I'll explain what that means. We clean it up. We airbrush the images. We make the images look great. They look their best. They're ready to hit the town. Then we pick a seed region. We pick a seed region where we want to average across all of the signal and then correlate that region with everything else. And you can pick multiple ones if you want to. And then correlate that with the rest of the brain. These are then converted to z-values because, in general, correlation values are a little bit skewed. They're not totally normally distributed. If we convert them to z-values, then they are. So this is a common pre-processing step. And Khan will give you both the R maps and the converted Z maps, depending on what you want to do with them. But if you're going to be running a statistical inference, the Z maps are the better ones to do those for. Okay. Before we take a quick break, I just want to introduce you to Neurosynth. I think I talk about it a little bit here, in case you want some more background on it. Let's see here. Oh, I could just enter in Neurosynth. Okay, so here's that meta-analysis software I was talking about earlier. Something else it can do, which is not as widely appreciated, is, let's see here. If you click on locations, and you click anywhere in this map, let's say, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and you click what's here. This is based on this 1,000 data set study by Thomas Yeo et al., I think back in 2011. So they had 1,000 subjects, and this creates these functional activation maps, functional connectivity maps based on those 1,000 subjects. So this default mode network I was talking about, you can find it here. Very robust, very reliable, very easy to find. If I select a seed over here, obviously it's going to be a little bit stronger now over here, but also it shows the same basic pattern. We can find things like the motor network, even when people are at rest, if I chose that correctly. Motor network, visual network obviously is a pretty similar one. So you can look up, you can Google Scholar any of these networks, take a look at what some of the most popular ones are, and generate those yourself. We'll be using similar seeds for the Khan demo as well. Okay, so we're going to take a 10-minute break. You can come up to me with any questions if you want. In the meantime, we'll reconvene at 2:05. Sorry, we'll go back in time. 2:15. And there's more pizza if you want it.